Hey everyone, welcome to day 2. I hope you've enjoyed your time so far with English 205 poetry section. We continue today with an essay by Gregory Orr called The Four Temperaments. Okay. In addition to reading this essay, you're going to crack open the textbook and read some poems in there. Okay. And then we're going to complete assignment 2, put some of this knowledge to practice. Before watching the rest of this video, I would like you to go ahead and read the Gregory Orr essay, The Four Temperaments. It's up on Blackboard. Read that and then come on back. Okay? So I'm going to pause. Go read it. Okay, you're back. All right. I hope you enjoyed the essay. My intention in having you read the essay first is just to sort of get the general lineaments of his theory in mind, so so I can quickly review it and then apply it with this example up here. Okay. So the first thing to keep in mind, now that you've read The Four Temperaments, right, is simply that this is Gregory Orr's theory. It's only Gregory Orr's theory, and Gregory Orr is just some guy. He's a poet, right, whatever, but this is just one view of how to describe the effects of poetry, right? And we are perfectly within our rights to disagree with him, right? There are many who think that this sort of bracketing of the different effects of poetry is a little stuffy, we might say, right? But I do think for those of us who are maybe a little unfamiliar with poetry, especially contemporary poetry, it's fairly useful in giving us a sense of the kinds of things that happen in poems and the way to sort of talk about the effects of poems. Because that's one thing we're going to work on in the next 4 weeks, is getting better about talking about these things, right? Describing a poem to someone else, talking critically about a poem's effects, right? So Greg Orr's big idea is that we can sort of divide a poem up into 4 temperaments, okay? The first temperament is story, right? You are very familiar with story now, having come off 4 weeks of fiction, right? So we know all about tension, about drama, about conflict, right? About some kind of setting, okay? So according to Orr, some stories are fairly, some poems are very story-based or fairly story-based. Okay, we can see this in the Heather McHugh poem that you read yesterday, right? A group of American poets go to Italy, etc., etc., etc. This happens. They go out to dinner. They get into this conversation. This guy starts talking. Blah, right? That's a narrative. Okay, and we're going to read some other poems. I keep wanting to say this semester. In this next 4 weeks, we're going to read some other poems that are narratives, right? Then there's structure. Okay, so Greg Orr talks about structure. I like to say form, right? These are just simply the measurable, quantifiable, formal elements of a poem. So we're talking about meter and rhyme, okay? We're talking about stanzas. We're talking about sonnets and villanelles and sestinas, these forms that poetry has been written in over the ages, right? But, Greg Orr doesn't go into depth here, but I think we're also talking about sort of those formal elements of free verse poetry as well. Things like line length, things like stanza breaks, line breaks, these sort of smaller free verse elements of structure that we'll be talking much, much more about in the coming days. Okay. He also talks about music, right? One temperament that many poets have, some poets have at least, is a great ear for language, right? For the sound of syllables together, right? For the rhythm of the language. So this encompasses things like strict meters, right? But it also encompasses, alliteration, right? Sally sold seashells by the seashore, right? Or consonants, assonance. What are some other effects? Onomatopoeia, right? Anything that you hear, right, is an aspect of the music of the poem. Okay, again, we'll be talking more about this. Right? And then finally there's imagination, which is perhaps the hardest thing to talk about. Orr says that it's simply the flow of image to image, right? Or thought to thought within a poem. The associative flow, how you get from one place to another. How you get from a story about American poets going to Italy to a pronouncement of what poetry is. right, in Heather McHugh's poem, for instance. Okay, so that's imagination. Simply, where does all this stuff come from, right? Orr says that poets are naturally inclined to certain temperaments. Okay, and so he lists, some famous poets who are more musical, some poets who are more story-based, some poets who are more imaginative-driven. Orr says that all of us have these natural temperaments in some quantity, right? And then it's the poet's job, after we've identified what our particular temperaments are, to go back and to work on the other temperaments, right? Maybe I'm really good at structure. I have a sort of math mind, right? And so I love fitting syllables together and making sure every line has 10 syllables and 5 major stretches and 14 lines. I love building these perfect sonnets, like little wooden boxes that click shut, right? But I'm not very good at the music of the line, right? So I practice at that, right? I practice at story, and I practice at music, and I practice at imagination in order to kind of get all my other levels up, okay? And this is where some people criticize Orr of being a little clinical in how he describes the making of poems, right? I mean, it's not as if we're all in our workshop, doing worksheets, figuring out how to write musically, right? It just, there are other ways to work on it, right? But Orr's idea is that any great poem is going to partake of all 4 of these temperaments to some extent, right? And I would agree. I think that's fairly true, right? So what I wanted to do, I wanted to share with you what I think is one great poem, okay? And to see if you agree, first of all, and then to apply Greg's 4 temperaments here, because for today's daily assignment, I'm going to want you to apply at least one of his temperaments to some of the poems that you're reading in the textbook today. Okay? So this poem here is by the great haiku master Basho, right? Translated by an American poet, Robert Hass. I chose a haiku because it's a very short poem, right? Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. Okay? I'm not sure how well you can see this all repeated here. Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. So, a famous poem, a poem about that sort of strange experience of being someplace and then longing for it, even though you're there already, I don't know if you guys have had this already, but a sort of almost preemptive longing, a preemptive loss of something so special like that. At least that's one interpretation of the poem, okay? So how might we apply the 4 temperaments here, just to see how things are working according to Greg Orr? Well, we might say that story is certainly exemplified by the fact that there is a small narrative going on here, right? Even in these 3 very short lines, okay, we have the implied story of the speaker of the poem in Kyoto, hearing a bird cry, and then longing for Kyoto, wanting to be in Kyoto, even though he was already in Kyoto, right? So a small story. It's not fully developed, naturally, but there is some tension, right? Obviously, okay? So story is present, right? Structure, well, it's a haiku, right? Haikus are 3-line poems, right, when they're translated into English. Sometimes there's a syllabic requirement. You guys know the 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables that some people play around with. Many English translations of haiku, don't pay attention to the syllable requirements. But there is an obvious structure, right? Music, music probably is not particularly prevalent here, but we do see that each line has about 3 strong beats, right? Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto, right? So a measured 3-syllable pattern there, right? And imagination is simply the impulse to write a poem about this experience, right? Impulse is very simply here the reason that the poet set this down to paper, okay? There's really no other way to talk about how imagination is played out here other than to say it's the reason for the existence of the poem.